purpose for writing his gospel, right? So far, we've gone through 8 chapters, and I know it's been a couple of months when we've laid that foundation of why we're even going into the book of John. And part of that foundation was the purpose. Like, what was John's purpose? We looked at John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31. And it's almost at the end of the book because John has 21 chapters. And so this is John basically summarizing what he's done, right? It says, and many other signs truly did Yahushua in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Yahushua is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name. So this was John's purpose. John is trying to establish that Yahushua is the Messiah and he is the Son of God. And the whole purpose of making us have this understanding and have this belief is so that we may be saved. So how does he do this, right? He does this 2 ways. The first way is by miracles, right? Chapters 2 to 11 is considered the book of miracles. Okay, why do miracles matter? We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. They matter because in John chapter 2, verse 11, it says, this beginning of miracles did Yahushua in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed on him. So the purpose of the miracles is to help the disciples believe on him. And even for us, as we now study his word, it helps us to believe, because all of this is how Yahushua is manifesting his glory. But even he says it's not even his own glory, but it's the glory of the Father. So we touched that when we spoke about miracles. And the other thing he does is he uses a lot of Yahushua's own testimonies or his own discourses, his conversations. He's not doing anything that was not already prophesied that he would do. So John uses a lot of that also in establishing Yahushua as being the Messiah. In chapter 1, he's called the Lamb of Elohim in verse 29. John the Baptist sees Yahushua. He says, Lamb of Elohim. This was a term that everyone was expecting that the Messiah was going to be. He was going to be that Lamb of Elohim. So that's one major clue in chapter 1. In chapter 2, we see the first miracle, which is at the wedding where he turned the water to wine. And that projects our mind forward to the Messiah when he was crucified and they pierced his side and water and wine came out, right? A lot of times when John is writing, he's connecting things to Yahweh's calendar, because the feast days, the calendars, they tell the story of salvation. So John couples these with what Yahushua is doing to kind of make it lift it off the page, right? It's not just what's written, what we do, but now understand why we do these things and why we have these sacred appointments. And so it just so happened that it was during Passover when Yahushua declares that he would raise the temple in 3 days, right? And so he's talking to the Pharisees and they're like, yo, it took 50 something years to build this temple and you're going to destroy it and build it in 3 days. But they didn't know that he was speaking of his flesh, right? And so we know that it was during Passover where Yahushua was crucified, right? That temple was destroyed, but in 3 days it was resurrected. And that we see that in chapter 2, verse 19. In chapter 3, Yahushua says, as the serpent was lifted up, the Son of Man will also be lifted up. That's verse 14. And we went back to in the Torah in Exodus, where Israel was being bit by these serpents, and Yahweh told Moses to make a brass serpent, and everyone that looked at the brass serpent and believed they would be healed, they were actually healed. So when they were doing that back in Exodus, they had no idea that this was like a prototype of salvation, right? Because Yahushua was also lifted up, and those who look upon him with belief were those who are going to be saved, just like in the wilderness. In chapter 4, Yahushua confesses to the Samaritan woman that he was the Messiah. And that was very pivotal because this is the first time he disclosed. He didn't even tell his disciples, And even when in some of the other synoptic gospels, when he did reveal who he was, he would say, don't tell anybody, right? It wasn't time for people to know, but he didn't tell this woman that, right? He tells this woman who was a foreigner outside of Israel, and she actually was the first person to go and run and to proclaim the gospel, right? I have found the Messiah is what she did. And after the Samaritans come and they fellowship with Yahushua and they say, now we believe, not based on what you said, but based on our own experience with him as the Messiah. And we saw that in chapter 4. In chapter 5, we have another healing at the pool at Bethesda on the Sabbath. And this is where all of Yahushua's woes began, because this is where the construct of Judaism at that time attacked him and wanted to stone him because, according to them, he broke the Sabbath. In chapter 6, we have another situation that's happening at Passover again. And he has this discourse on being the bread of life, which goes hand in hand with Passover, because one of the highlights or the centerpieces of Passover is the matzah, the unleavened bread. And so Yahushua uses this opportunity to again bring life to what it is that we're doing. And then we also have the miracle of feeding the multitude with the 5 fish and 2 loaves. Chapter 7, we have the Feast of Tabernacles, another holy day, and then we have the discourse of living water, and that was all connected with this the water libation that they did at the last day of Tabernacles. And Yahushua was like, screaming, hey, I'm it, right? Everything you over there doing with this water, this whole ritual, I am it. I am that living water. And then last week, we talked about Yahushua spoke about being the light of the world, right? So these are all some of the highlights that we've covered so far in the 8th chapter. If you enjoyed that snippet and would like to join us for Bible study, please send me an email at titus2lifecoaching@gmail.com. We study every Tuesday, Yah willing, at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Until next time, Shalom, Queens.